Nickie, over to you.
Hi, everybody. So yes, I'm just going to have a chat about forest gardening. This is really just going to be an introduction and some resources to help you get started if you're inspired by trying to develop your own little patch of forest garden in your back gardens. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So can you all see that?
No.
Yep. Right, and I'll just big that up a bit. There we go. So forest gardening in your back garden. I'm just going to show you just a brief video to begin with, just as a way of inspiration, really, so we know the sort of thing that I'm talking about. This is a forest garden in the southwest of England, near Schumacher College in Dartington. Created by a guy called Martin Crawford, and this is just a 3-minute video, and it'll just give you a sense of the sort of thing that I'm talking about.
If you do nothing to a piece of land in temperate climates, it will become a forest. The forces of nature are actively moving the land towards a balanced, sustainable, and resilient ecosystem. This is called succession. In southwest England, an unusual forest is growing. Nut trees, fruit trees, shrubs, and perennial vegetables are planted in a way that mimics a natural woodland. This forest garden is the life's work of Martin Crawford, an unconventional gardener who grows 500 edible plants with just a few hours of maintenance per month.
What we think of as normal in terms of food production is actually not normal at all. Annual plants are very rare in nature, and yet most of our agricultural fields are full of annual plants. It's not normal. What's normal is a more forested or semi-forested system. Forest gardens in a temperate climate tend to have 7 layers or so: high trees, smaller trees, shrubs, perennials, ground cover layers, root crops, and climbers. So it includes directly useful plants, many types of fruit trees, both the common ones and much less common fruit trees, all the types of nuts, tuber crops, vegetables, medicinal plants, timber, but also logs that you might grow other things on, like mushrooms. There are also plants of indirect use, system plants, to help the system function better, and that includes nitrogen-fixing plants, mineral accumulators, plants to attract beneficial insects to eat all your pests. Forest gardens are very beautiful places to be in, because although they're managed, the management is light, so they have this very naturalistic feel to them, and it is more like being out in nature than being in a cultivated garden. It can seem a bit overwhelming. There's so many different species. You shouldn't let that stop you from beginning a project, because you don't have to know everything to begin with. Just start, plant some trees, and go from there. It's not the gradually increasing temperatures that damage plants. It's the increase in extreme events, big storms, big winds, very heavy rain, hail, droughts. By having a very diverse system, whatever happens to the weather, most of your crops will probably do fine. Some may fail, some may do better. That's very important going into the future, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen to our weather. So by having a diverse system, it gives you maximum resilience.
I'm trying to get off this now. Hang on. What's going on here? Right, let's get it to the end.
We can still see you, Nickie, in a little box.
I'm just going to stop sharing and then reshare.
Okay, that's it.
Oh, the joys of Zoom. Right. Oh. Why has it gone back to me? Hang on, I'll try that again. I might have to leave it on the this view. Okay, so I'll just use it like this. Yeah, so the idea of a forest garden is really to create the woodland edge. So woodland edge is the most diverse part of the sort of landscape. I mean, you can see from this picture here that you've got a great range of different sorts of plants, so trees and shrubs and lots of ground cover. And if you go into a woodland, so this is what I do when I'm trying to design my own woodland garden, is I go to places like Sally in the Woods and I look at the different plants that are growing together, and then I replicate some of that in my own garden. And you'll find that other than beech woodland, which has got a thick layer of leaves at the base, that most woodlands, and particularly the woodland edge, is just completely covered in plants. So it's green throughout the ground. So it's a place of rich diversity in terms of plant life, and that attracts a rich diversity in terms of insects and wildlife. So butterflies, insects, mice, voles, that sort of thing. So it's a really rich, diverse environment, and that's really what we're trying to create with a forest garden. It's a kind of designed beginnings of an edible ecosystem. So as Martin Crawford was saying, to help us develop this garden, to think about the design of the garden, we think of it in terms of 7 layers. I mean, there could be more layers, there could be less layers, but the standard thing is the 7 layers. So we think about the great big tall trees, and we're thinking about it in terms of edible trees, and then lower level trees, a shrub layer, which is things like currants, raspberries, that sort of thing, a herbaceous layer, so things like mints, sages, that sort of thing. And then thinking about the soil surface, so ground cover, so things like strawberries, creeping raspberries, alpine strawberries, creeping jenny, those kinds of plants. And then we think about the roots. Now, roots are quite important. One of the great things about the things with long roots is they're called things, we would term them mineral miners. So things like comfrey or salsify that have got long, deep roots, they bring up potassium and so it's potassium and phosphate and magnesium from deep in the ground and bring that up to nourish other plants around them. And then we think about the vertical layer, so climbers going up into the trees. And that's kind of how we think about designing the gardens. And as I say, you end up with this sort of, over time, a gradually self-sustaining edible ecosystem requiring kind of minimal intervention. And I think that was probably one of the things that you spoke about with your previous talk. So minimal intervention means very little digging. I mean, we don't want to disturb the soil if we can avoid that, because the soil contains, well, many good things, but one of the things that's contained in the surface layer of the soil is mycorrhizomes. So they're like fungal hyphae that have a symbiotic relationship with the roots of trees and perennial plants in general. So trees and shrubs and herbs, and they help to sequestrate carbon, so that's really important. And they also help to transfer important nutrients like potassium and magnesium between plants. And they can actually do that over hundreds of meters. So, you know, a plant that's lacking in magnesium may be able to get magnesium from another part of the area that's being transmitted by the mycorrhizomes. So that's really important. And that's one of the big reasons for not tilling the soil or digging the soil if you can help it. And as part of this sort of low effort, we wouldn't be doing things like clearing away fallen branches or fallen leaves. We would leave those on the surface to rot down and to help create a really good, nutritious soil. If you talk to a forest gardener, they will tell you how important the soil is, and the soil is the sort of the lifeblood of the garden. So really focusing on maintaining a really good, rich, deep soil, and then everything else kind of looks after itself. So yeah, so we talk about biodiversity, so a rich mix of edible plants or plants that have system roles. So when I say system roles, I mean things like, so for example, in my garden, I've got lots of primroses, and they come out just before the apple blossom is in full bloom. And what that helps with is I've attracted the bees and the insects into the garden just before the apple trees start flowering. And so that's their system role, their pollinators, their bee attractors. This is going to be really useful for pollinating the other fruit and vegetable plants that I've got growing in my garden. And I get those fantastic crop of Bramley apples, far too many, better than in other gardens that I've had. And I think it's maybe because of the pollinators that I've got planted in the garden. But also things like nitrogen fixers. So the pea family, the pea and bean family, is brilliant for fixing nitrogen, and that helps to create a good, rich, nutritious soil. So deliberately planting in plants that are good for nitrogen fixation. So we've got our next door neighbours have got some alder trees, and they're really good for nitrogen fixation. And I've planted lupins in my forest garden, and with the hope, and lupins and alfalfa, both of which should be nutritious for the soil, and that will help other plants grow. Ceanothus is another good nitrogen fixer. Yes, there you go, look after the soil. So that's just the kind of mindset when you're thinking about planting up a forest garden. So thinking about the different layers that make up a woodland, as well as your fruit and vegetable, your perennial fruit and vegetable. And that's really important because perennials don't take up as much energy as an annual plant. So I have very few annuals in my forest garden. It's nearly all perennials. So thinking about the structure, the 7 layers, and then the system plants within that. So the things that are going to keep the ecosystem going, so that in a few years' time it doesn't all collapse because I've forgotten to put in plants that help other plants to survive. So getting started. So I'm imagining that if you're thinking about doing a forest garden in your own garden, you've probably got stuff already planted in your garden, and you might want to start your forest garden under a tree that's already there, for example. So in my front garden, I've got a crabapple tree, and I've started a forest garden that's going to utilise the crabapple tree as the top layer. And then I've done some underplanting underneath that, and I'll be able to show you some pictures in a minute. So just thinking about what you've already got in your garden and how you're going to adapt that to your forest garden. But there are some things, some sort of general things to think about. Ooh. And I think about it in terms of thinking about the soil. So when I've been doing the garden at work, I've tested the soil to see what it's got in terms of nutrients, what are the nitrate levels, the potassium levels, the phosphate levels, and that's helped me to select some of the plants for that garden. Then I think in terms of sunlight. So where's the sun coming from? Which are the shaded bits of the garden, and which are the more sunny bits of the garden? And then thinking about how I select plants that are going to thrive mostly in those different sort of areas of shade and darkness. So for example, mint and lemon balm, they thrive in shade, whereas other plants like, I don't know, white currants need to live in a better lit area. So it's just thinking about that. Thinking about the wind and the wind direction, and do you need to put some shelter up to protect your plants? I mean, most of us will have gardens with hedges, and that will be sufficient. But it's just to be aware of that. So I've got some currants in my front garden, and my front garden's a bit windy and they're not doing very well. And it's because I didn't really pay enough attention to the wind and the wind direction, and thinking how I might either protect those plants or plant them somewhere that was a bit more sheltered. And then thinking about watering. So I'm very lucky in some ways in that my front garden would be a bit of a bog if I didn't have lots of plants in there. But initially, if you're planting fruit trees, for example, they're going to need quite a lot of water. So thinking about your water solutions, and there's lots of different ways you could do that, whether it's, you know, with water butts or these things called swales, which are like dips in the ground that collect water. But just thinking about how you're going to water your garden, and that's important for the first 2 or 3 years. But once the garden gets established, like any other garden, it needs less attention. So these are the 3 books that I found most useful and that I refer to when I'm helping to do my forest garden. So this one here by Patrick Whitefield. So he was probably the first forest gardener in the UK. I mean, forest gardens have been going on a long time in the tropics, but they're relatively new to the UK, or to temperate regions. And Patrick Whitefield's got a great garden up in Staffordshire. But he goes through the real practicalities of how to start a border up, how to design your garden in terms of the shape of the plants, you know, how to build or how to create wind shelters, and just real practical stuff. And also he talks about it a bit from a sort of systems approach, how the plants interact with each other, and the sort of mindset and the underpinning behind forest gardening. So I find his book quite useful. This is a real whistle-stop tour, I'm afraid. This book here, the Martin Crawford book, is brilliant for just helping you select your plants. Yeah, it's just a really good sort of reference book for selecting plants. And this book here by Thomas Remiarts, so he's got a forest garden in Herefordshire, and his forest gardens are mostly community gardens. So if you were wanting to develop something within your local villages, that's quite a good book for that. I mean, it's practical, but it also goes through things like how to develop your team and all that sort of thing as well, or his top tips anyway. So they're probably these 2 are the most useful, and then that if you're deciding to do something more community based. So I'm just going to take you very briefly, because this is such a whistle-stop tour and I can't really tell you very much about forest gardening. I'm just going to take you to a couple of websites which are quite helpful. So if it's going to let me. Yeah, okay, so really the reason for bringing you to this website, other than it's the organisation that I'm a director for, but it's quite the thing that's really useful here, if you're going to do this sort of thing in your back garden, is this bit here on the website, the forest garden in a box. Now, these forest gardens do not have to be put in planters, but it's really good for giving you the sort of groups of plants that work well together. So for example, this 3 metre by 3 metre plot. Let's have a look. So it goes through the selection of trees and plants that you might use in that, and that includes plants within, I think this is just using the lower 5 layers, because it's a smaller area, there's not enough space for big trees. Or you could use this sort of grouping of plants which work well together, they support each other, it covers the 7 layers, and they've got you know, system plants within there. So things like lavender and muskmallow are great for attracting insects that's going to pollinate other plants around them, for example. And comfrey, there's no forest garden is complete without comfrey. I mean, comfrey is just an amazing plant. Not only is it a mineral miner, it's if you chop it, you can chop it 2 or 3 times a year and just lay it down on the ground, and it will decompose, and it's full of nutrients for the plants. It's a great fertilizer. It spreads like mad though. So in my garden here, I've ordered something called Russian comfrey, which has sterile seeds. So I can keep it a bit more under control. That you're not supposed to talk about control in forest gardens. When it comes to comfrey, I think you're allowed to, but it's a fantastic plant. And here you go. So it's got your sweet pea in there with clover as your nitrogen fixer.
Nickie, I'm not seeing that. I'm still on your slide.
Oh.
I don't know if that's true for others, probably is.
Yeah, we don't have, we can't see what you're seeing, I don't think, other than the website.
Okay.
But it makes sense what you're saying, so don't worry.
Okay, but it is a good website to go to.
Yeah.
Let me get, so I'm going to, there's another website I want to take you to, so I'm going to stop sharing and then reshare with the other website. I'll just get that up and reshare. Okay, so this is really great for, again, finding out about your plants. So it's called Plants for a Future, which is an organisation that's based down in Cornwall. And then their mission was basically to try and, I suppose, reintroduce some of the rarer perennial fruit and vegetables that are gradually disappearing. But you could pretty much look up any plant. If I just put it, I'll put in comfrey. Can you see this? Yeah. And it's great, and it'll go through the medicinal value, the edible ratings. Here you go, sort of the size of the plant, tells you how fast it grows. If it's got system uses, it'll tell you about that. Yeah, so it's really, really good. I use this website all the time. There's also, they have a book as well, Plants for a Future book. I find the website the most useful thing. And if you wanted to find plants that were good for shade, you can just look up shade plants, or if you wanted nitrogen fixers, you could look up nitrogen fixing plants. And so it's a really useful website. So I'm going to stop sharing and go back to the other one. Okay. Oh, so this is this is the start of our garden in the front, and this is a picture of, this is my son here helping me start to develop our forest garden. We only planted it up this year, but the borders here. This is the sort of going to be this is the crab tree that I talked about, and we've planted another apple tree here and a pear tree here. But to get it started, we've laid a layer of cardboard down on the grass to essentially kill the grass. Then a layer of horse manure, which we've got a stables just down the road, and I've been trucking up and down and up and down and up and down, pouring horse manure on there. And we did that 3 times. So we had cardboard, horse manure, cardboard, horse manure, cardboard, horse manure, and then bark chip over the top. And that's kind of how we've started developing the good, rich soil. You can plant into that straight away if you want. So what we've done is we've cut circles out where we put the plants, filled the circles with compost, and then planted straight into that. Or you leave it for 3 months and it'll rot down, and then you can plant directly into it. And I've got lots of fungus coming up from that, from the mixture of the bark chips and the horse manure, I think. So that's that's all very good. I haven't got any weeds yet. So, but that's a kind of how you can get started with developing the soil to begin with. And a description of how to do that and the various methods of starting preparing your grounds are in that Patrick Whitefield book. Okay, so choosing your plants, I think we talked a little bit about where you can get some information from about choosing your plants, and also just noticing what grows well in the hedgerows and the woodlands around you, and then finding cultivated versions of that. Yeah, so many options, so little time. This is just an example of a selection of plants that you might choose. So we would call these plant guilds. And you may have heard that if you've got anything to do with the world of permaculture, you may have come across this term, but it's basically the selection of plants that we would use. So this is just an example. So you've got the walnut tree as your big tree, and walnuts have their pros and cons. They produce a toxin in the soil to stop other trees growing near them. And then we've got the apple trees, the smaller sub-canopy layer, that would be called, growing below that. And then you've got your shrub layer here. I mean, here they've put blueberry bushes. Now, those are acid-loving trees, so they're bushes. So that's great if you've got a sort of ericaceous soil. But you don't need to use those. You could use gooseberries or currants, or you could use a sage. And then your herbaceous layer, and herbaceous doesn't necessarily mean herbs, but it could do. It could be mints, but they're plants that rot down and lose their leaves. So they lose their leaves over the summer, and then they grow up from the base again so they lose their leaves in the autumn and grow up in the spring. But here we've got daylilies, and I don't know whether anybody's eaten a daylily, but you can eat the flowers. It's got a sort of beefy taste to them. And then we've got the root crops here. Okay, yeah, so the ground cover, so they've got wood sorrel, and that grows really well in this area. I can tell you because we've got too much of it at home. And then the root layer, so they've got turnips, but you could have I guess you could have salsify, or I mean your root layer, you could put in your comfrey as your root layer, because you're growing it for the ability of its roots to bring the minerals up from the deeper below. And then the vine layer, and in temperate climes, the vine layer is the more difficult layer for us. We don't have many edible plants that grow in vine-like ways. I mean, yes, we've got grapes, but there's not a lot else. Yeah. So there are one or two forest gardens near us. So there's one that's just was planted about 3 or 4 years ago in Alice Park. It's part of the Transition Lark Hall group, but you can go and visit that. It's got a big wooden shelter. As you go into Alice Park, it's just on the left. It's got a kind of big wooden shelter just before you go in. So that's if you're wanting a bit of inspiration, that's worth a visit. You can go and visit Martin Crawford's garden. That's open to the public. But there are other gardens that are listed on the National Forest Garden website. There's a big list of 100 or so forest gardens that you can go and visit. So that's a real whistle-stop tour. Have I got time to talk a little bit about the RUH garden?
Yes, please, Nickie.
I'll be brief. So I'm working with a team of people from the RUH. Well, and they're a whole mix of clinical staff, admin staff, estates, the sustainability team. There's about 30 of us working on a project to to develop a forest garden for well-being at the Royal United Hospital. So in the courtyard that's in front of the old entrance from the old 1916 entrance, which is currently a car park, we're developing about a third of that into a forest garden, and it's been specifically designed to support well-being. So not only are we using sort of forest garden techniques and that biodiversity to really help people connect with nature, we've had a landscape architect work with us who's got a background in psychology as well, and she's helped us with the design so that it works as well as we can make it work to support mostly staff well-being. I think as the garden develops or as the concept develops, we're hoping to develop more of the RUH grounds to support so that it's like a health and well-being campus rather than just a hospital with ground around it. So this is the kind of first part of that project. Is there anything else I can tell you about that? I think it's a work in progress at the moment. We're busy fundraising for it at the moment. Yeah, so that's where we're at with that.